Welcome to my channel. Today we revisit one of the most haunting air disasters in modern aviation, a story that began with laughter, family, and pride but ended in tragedy thousands of feet above the frozen Siberian landscape. This is the chilling tale of Aeroflot Flight 593, a flight that should have been routine but became a heartbreaking lesson in how one simple, innocent mistake can spiral into unthinkable catastrophe. The night was calm on March 23, 1994. The Airbus A310 sat on the tarmac of Sheremetyevo International Airport in Moscow, gleaming under the cold runway lights. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Andrei Danilov, a respected and experienced pilot, known for his discipline and precision. With him were First Officer Yaroslav Kudrinsky and a small crew ready for a long flight to Hong Kong. But this journey was not just another professional duty for the co-pilot, it was something deeply personal. His teenage children, Eldar and Yana, were on board, traveling with him on what was meant to be a rare family trip. For the children, the idea of flying with their father was magical, a chance to see the world from the sky, to touch the stars. For Kudrinsky, it was a proud father's moment, showing his children the life he loved. As passengers settled in, unaware of the fate that awaited them, the plane roared to life and lifted into the night sky, climbing steadily toward its cruising altitude. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was relaxed, even cheerful. The crew had switched to autopilot, and the A310 hummed smoothly through the cold night. Yana, the co-pilot's daughter, was the first to be invited into the cockpit. The glow of the instrument panels reflected softly on her face as she sat behind her father, mesmerized by the endless expanse of stars through the windshield. Her father smiled proudly as she watched the digital displays flicker, fascinated by the language of flight. When she returned to her seat, her brother Eldar replaced her, eager and curious. It was a gesture of fatherly affection, harmless in appearance, something many pilots had done in quieter days. But this night, fate had other plans. Kudrinsky, trying to make his son's experience special, allowed Eldar to sit in the captain's seat, under his close watch. The autopilot was engaged, and the aircraft was stable. In a moment that seemed innocent, he told his son to lightly turn the control yoke, explaining how it felt to steer the massive jet. But what neither of them realized was that this simple act, this single twist of the controls, would silently disengage part of the autopilot system. Without warning, the flight computer stopped controlling the plane's roll. The Airbus began to drift slightly to the right, a slow, almost invisible movement. The cockpit's quiet chatter masked the danger creeping in. The co-pilot, distracted by his son's curiosity and comforted by the apparent calm, didn't notice that the plane was beginning a gradual bank. The night outside was pitch black, the horizon invisible. There were no external clues to show the subtle tilt of the aircraft. Within minutes, the plane rolled further, its nose dipping, engines humming steadily as if nothing were wrong. A tiny amber light flickered on the panel, a warning, but it went unnoticed in the laughter and soft hum of conversation. The autopilot, half disengaged, was fighting against human input. The system was confused, torn between manual and automated control. The A310's sensors recorded the conflict silently as the tilt grew steeper, gravity slowly shifting inside the cabin. Eldar's hands tightened on the control column as he felt the aircraft lean, and his father, realizing something was wrong, quickly reached over. He took control, his smile gone, replaced by alarm. "What's happening?" he muttered. The instruments told a strange story. The plane was banking sharply, descending slowly but firmly. The first officer tried to re-engage the autopilot, but it refused, locked in confusion. Within seconds, the plane tilted beyond 30 degrees, and the horizon vanished entirely from view. Alarms screamed through the cockpit, a sudden chorus of warning chimes and computerized voices. The crew sprang into action, hands moving frantically across switches and throttles. The captain grabbed the controls, trying to pull the plane level. The artificial horizon was spinning now, the G-forces pressing them into their seats. Eldar froze in shock, unable to comprehend the terror he had unknowingly unleashed. The flight data recorder later captured the chaos, a desperate struggle to recover a plane that no longer responded predictably. In the cabin, passengers began to notice something was wrong. The hum of conversation turned into murmurs as drinks slid off trays and the plane began to tilt violently. Luggage shifted in the overhead bins, and someone screamed as the lights flickered. The cabin crew tried to calm everyone, but the sudden drop sent hearts racing. The plane nosedived briefly, then pulled up sharply as the pilots fought back. The engines roared, the aircraft's wings groaned under the pressure. Inside the cockpit, the pilots were drenched in sweat, their eyes darting between instruments and the black void beyond the windshield. The captain shouted for altitude data, his voice trembling but firm. "Pull! Pull up!" echoed in the tight space. The Airbus responded slowly, shuddering under the violent maneuvers. They managed to lift the nose, climbing momentarily, only to stall seconds later. The plane rolled almost upside down before plunging again, losing thousands of feet in seconds. The world outside turned into a blur of clouds and darkness, then flashes of white snow as the ground loomed closer. On the radar screens below, air traffic controllers in Novokuznetsk watched in confusion. Flight 593 had suddenly dropped from its assigned altitude. They called out repeatedly, "Aeroflot 593, do you read?" But there was no reply. Only static. Inside the plane, chaos ruled. The captain's voice cut through the alarm tones as he tried one last recovery maneuver, pushing the throttles forward, pulling the yoke with all his strength. The engines screamed, the wings flexed violently, but it was too late. At over 400 miles per hour, the Airbus slammed into a remote mountainside in Siberia, breaking apart on impact. The explosion was visible for miles, lighting up the night sky in an eerie glow that faded into silence. When rescue teams finally reached the site, they found the wreckage scattered across the frozen valley, smoke still rising from the snow. There were no survivors. The discovery was heartbreaking: children's toys among the debris, pieces of flight manuals torn and scattered, and fragments of a once proud airliner reduced to ashes. As investigators combed through the wreckage, they recovered the flight data and cockpit voice recorders, uncovering the truth behind the mystery. What they heard was gut-wrenching, laughter turning to alarm, confusion to terror, and finally, the sound of silence. The transcript revealed the precise moment the autopilot had disengaged and how a loving father's gesture had unknowingly set off a chain reaction that neither training nor experience could reverse. The investigation found that the Airbus's flight control system, though advanced, was not fully understood by all pilots during that era of transition from analog to digital flying. The partial disconnection of the autopilot went unnoticed, and the delayed response proved fatal. The incident shocked the world. Aviation authorities revised training programs, emphasizing cockpit discipline and system awareness. New regulations were enforced, ensuring that no unauthorized individuals would ever be allowed near cockpit controls during flight. But beyond the technical lessons, there was something deeply human about this tragedy, a reminder of how quickly love, pride, and innocence can turn to heartbreak. The image of a boy in the cockpit, smiling beside his father, remains one of the most haunting symbols in aviation history. As the years passed, Flight 593 became a story told not just by investigators, but by families, pilots, and historians, a story of human error wrapped in emotion, of progress shadowed by pain. Even today, when the wind sweeps across that cold Siberian ridge, it carries the echoes of the voices lost that night. A father's pride, a son's innocence, and a moment of human fragility that changed aviation forever. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found it moving and want to explore more true air disaster documentaries like this one, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Every week, we uncover the real stories behind the world's most unforgettable flights, stories that remind us how fragile life can be, and how every second in the sky carries the weight of countless lives below. As the dawn crept across the vast Siberian horizon, the world was still unaware that a modern jetliner had vanished overnight. Families waiting in Hong Kong checked their watches, expecting their loved ones to emerge from the terminal, unaware that the plane carrying them had already met its fate thousands of miles away. Back in Moscow, silence hung in the operations center. Aeroflot's communication team had lost contact with Flight 593 hours ago. What began as a small delay soon turned into dread. Repeated radio calls went unanswered, and radar screens showed nothing but static. The aircraft had disappeared from the skies as if swallowed by the night itself. Search and rescue operations were launched, but the Siberian wilderness was merciless. Endless snow, jagged cliffs, and freezing winds that erased any trace of wreckage. Meanwhile, in the quiet homes of the passengers, phones began to ring. Mothers, fathers, and children picked up expecting joy, only to hear the trembling voices of officials saying, "We have lost contact with the aircraft." In that moment, every heartbeat froze. The story that began with laughter now turned into collective horror. No one wanted to believe that a father and his children, an entire flight of ordinary people, had simply vanished into thin air. Hours later, search helicopters spotted a faint column of smoke rising from the slopes of the Kuznetsk-Alatau Mountains. The pilot tilted his chopper forward, eyes narrowing through the fog, and what appeared below was a sight too devastating to comprehend. The snow was blackened for miles, a scar across the earth marking where Flight 593 had struck. The fuselage was gone, scattered across ridges like broken glass. Tiny fragments of metal glistened under the pale light. There were no cries, no movement, just the sound of the wind sweeping through twisted steel. Rescue workers landed nearby and stepped out into the snow, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. What they found confirmed the worst. The aircraft had disintegrated on impact. Personal belongings were scattered, suitcases torn open, family photographs fluttering in the cold wind, a small teddy bear half buried in ice. One rescuer knelt down, his gloved hand trembling as he picked up a child's shoe. The silence around him felt heavy, as if the mountain itself mourned the loss. The team worked slowly, collecting evidence, marking the wreckage, and calling out coordinate. But deep down, they knew, no one had survived. In Moscow, news agencies began to break the story. Television anchors spoke in solemn tones, their voices carrying across the nation. Aeroflot Flight 593 has crashed in Siberia. There are no survivors. The country fell into collective grief. Families gathered around screens, their faces pale with disbelief. The airline, once proud of its modern fleet and international routes, now stood at the center of one of the most tragic disasters in its history. Questions flooded in. What went wrong? Was it weather? A mechanical failure? Sabotage? For hours, speculation ran wild. But only the black boxes, deep in the wreckage, held the truth. Investigators arrived on-site days later, wrapped in thick winter coats, braving sub-zero temperatures. The first thing they noticed was the unusual spread of debris, pieces of the plane scattered across a wide arc, suggesting the jet was intact until the moment of impact. This meant it hadn't exploded mid-air. Something had caused the plane to lose control entirely before hitting the mountainside. When they recovered the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, encased in layers of ice and twisted metal, they knew they held the final seconds of Flight 593's existence. Back in Moscow, in a dimly lit analysis room, investigators gathered around the playback system. The first sounds were ordinary, routine checklists, calm voices, the faint hum of engines. But soon, a different tone filled the room. Laughter, a child's voice, then the co-pilot's soft chuckle. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. A child's voice wasn't supposed to be in a cockpit recording. They continued listening, and the laughter turned into confusion. Alarms began to beep, the sound growing sharper. Then came frantic voices, overlapping commands, and the unmistakable strain of terror. One investigator pressed pause, staring at the timestamp. The timeline matched precisely when the aircraft began its fatal descent. It became clear that something deeply human, something emotional and innocent, had led to this unimaginable disaster. As they continued to listen, they heard the co-pilot's voice shouting orders, the captain's firm commands, and the rising pitch of the autopilot warnings. But amidst all the chaos, there was a young boy's frightened whisper. "Papa, what's happening?" That single line broke every heart in the room. As words spread among the investigation teams, disbelief turned to heartbreak. No one could fathom how such a situation had unfolded. Yet the data recorder confirmed what the voices suggested. The autopilot had partially disengaged because of manual pressure on the control column. The system, following its programming, quietly handed control back to the human pilot without any loud warning. This moment of misunderstanding sealed the fate of all aboard. The co-pilot, believing the plane was still under automatic control, hadn't realized the aircraft was rolling slowly to the right. The error was subtle at first, a slight tilt, barely noticeable in the dark. But within minutes it became a deadly spiral. The captain, returning to the cockpit after a short break, had walked into a nightmare. By then, the aircraft was already beyond recovery. The more they pulled, the more the jet fought against itself, its nose dipping as it lost altitude at a terrifying rate. The engines screamed as they tried to climb, but the plane was trapped in its own momentum, descending fast toward the mountains. In the following days, the media began to circle around the story of the boy in the cockpit. Rumors spread faster than facts, painting a picture of negligence, recklessness, and scandal. The airline faced an avalanche of criticism. Pilots across the world reacted with shock and anger, calling it a violation of every safety rule in aviation. Yet behind the headlines was a story far more complex. A story of a father who had wanted to share a moment of joy with his child, never imagining it would cost them everything. In private, investigators and fellow pilots grieved quietly. They understood what it meant to be a father, to want your children to see your world, to make them proud. But the skies have no mercy for sentiment. In aviation, even the smallest lapse can be fatal. Every switch, every warning light, every decision carries the weight of hundreds of lives. As the official report was released, the truth was laid bare. The crash had been caused by a combination of human error and inadequate system awareness. The autopilot's design, though advanced, did not provide a clear warning when partially disengaged. The crew's lack of immediate recognition turned a recoverable error into an unrecoverable catastrophe. But the report also carried an undertone of compassion, a recognition that this was not an act of arrogance or carelessness, but of human vulnerability. The father, the son, and every soul aboard were victims of a moment that spiraled beyond control. Their story became a lesson carved into the foundations of aviation safety. From that day forward, cockpit access policies changed worldwide, ensuring that no unauthorized person would ever touch the controls again. But no rule or regulation could erase the emotional scars left behind. In the cold Siberian winter, a memorial was built near the crash site. Families traveled long distances to lay flowers and light candles, their tears freezing on their cheeks as they stood before the engraved names. Among them was a photograph of a smiling boy beside his father in uniform, a haunting image of love and loss. The villagers nearby still speak of strange echoes on windy nights, as if voices from above whisper through the pines. Perhaps it's only the wind, or perhaps it's the memory of that night, the laughter that turned into cries, the lesson written in the sky. And as investigators closed the final pages of the report, one of them looked out of the window at the gray Moscow skyline and said quietly, "It wasn't just a crash. It was a tragedy of love, trust, and one moment of human imperfection." Those words would echo long after the case was closed, reminding generations of pilots and passengers alike that even in the safest skies, humanity's greatest strength, its heart, can also be its most fragile weakness. In the days that followed, the world struggled to understand how something so unimaginable could happen on a modern jetliner flown by experienced pilots. News outlets from Moscow to London to New York ran headlines filled with disbelief. A boy at the controls, the tragedy that should never have happened, father's love turns fatal. Families of the victims watched the news in silence, torn between anger and sorrow. Some refused to believe the reports at all, insisting there must have been another cause. To them, it was easier to think of a mechanical failure, a storm, or a freak system malfunction than to accept that a father's moment of affection could lead to such devastation. But as the days passed and the voice recorder transcripts were released, the truth settled like a heavy shadow. The voices were unmistakable, the laughter, the calm explanations of the co-pilot, the startled cry when things began to go wrong, and finally the desperate commands shouted over the alarms. Each word told the story of a man realizing, too late, that his world was falling apart before his eyes. In the investigation center, the black boxes were studied frame by frame, sound by sound. Specialists examined the flight data graphs, tracing the moments when the control inputs began to shift. They saw the autopilot disconnect partially, the steady climb become a slow descent, the small roll turn into a violent spiral. Every second was mapped out, every decision analyzed. The patterns told a chilling story, not of incompetence, but of confusion, of a human brain trying to make sense of conflicting signals in a moment of panic. The Airbus A310 was one of the most sophisticated planes of its time, built with layers of redundancy and automation. But in this case, technology had quietly handed over control without shouting a clear warning, trusting the human to notice what the system itself failed to announce. The investigators realized that this subtle flaw, this silent transition from automation to manual, was something few pilots had ever truly practiced for. And when they matched this finding with the cockpit audio, the tragedy took on a painfully human shape. The audio revealed the first warning tone, soft at first, ignored because it blended with the background hum of flight. Then the shift in pitch, the confused exchange between pilot. "What's wrong?" one voice asked. "I don't know," replied another. The instruments were showing a right bank, the altitude slightly decreasing. "Level the wings," the captain said, his tone still calm. But within seconds, calm turned to chaos. The plane rolled further, the alarms blaring now, the G-forces pressing against their chests. The captain shouted, "My controls!" trying to regain authority, but by then the aircraft's momentum was too strong. The nose dipped sharply, and the artificial horizon spun. In those final minutes, the pilots fought with every ounce of strength and training, pulling, adjusting, throttling up, trying to wrestle the jet back from its death dive. Their voices rose with desperation, commands overlapping, warnings screaming, the cockpit filled with chaos. Yet through it all, the faint sound of the boys' breathing could still be heard, a sound that would haunt everyone who listened to it. For the families, the discovery of that recording was like reopening a wound. They could hear their loved ones' final moments, the calm professionalism, the panic, and the silence that followed. Many refused to listen again. But the investigators had to. They listened hundreds of times, trying to piece together the exact sequence of human reactions and machine responses that led to the crash. The more they studied, the more they understood that this was not just a story about one man's mistake, it was about how fragile the line between control and chaos truly is at 30,000 feet. The cockpit had been filled with advanced instruments, lights, and systems designed to protect, but in the end, what mattered was still the human behind them. It was a lesson that would reshape training programs across the world. Meanwhile, Aeroflot's management faced the public storm. Press conferences were tense, emotions high. A reporter asked, "Why was a child in the cockpit?" The airline's spokesperson hesitated before replying, his voice barely steady. "It was not authorized. It should never have happened." The statement hung in the air, cold and absolute. In the following weeks, new policies were introduced immediately. Cockpit access strictly limited, passenger visits prohibited under all circumstances, and pilot conduct placed under tighter scrutiny. But for many, the damage had already been done. Trust had been shaken. Other airlines quietly reviewed their own procedures, realizing that what happened in one cockpit could happen anywhere if complacency ever took root. As winter deepened, the crash site became a place of mourning. Families braved the bitter wind to reach the mountain, escorted by rescue teams through snow-covered trails. They brought photographs, flowers, and letters sealed in plastic to protect them from the cold. Some knelt in silence, others cried openly, their voices carried away by the wind. One woman placed a small toy plane in the snow and whispered, "He loved flying." Another man, his eyes red and hollow, murmured, "I forgive him." The father of one of the victims stood alone, his breath visible in the freezing air, staring at the horizon where the sky met the mountains. He said softly, "They are all in the sky now." It was a moment of collective grief, shared by strangers bound by tragedy. Over time, documentaries and reports brought the story to the world. The phrase, "the boy in the cockpit," became synonymous with a lesson etched in aviation history, a story of how even the smallest human gesture, however innocent, can alter the course of hundreds of lives. But beyond the facts there was something deeper, something that touched people on a level beyond aviation. It was about love, family, and the cost of one fleeting decision. Pilots who read about the case often found themselves thinking of their own families, imagining the pride in their children's eyes, and feeling the quiet ache of what it must have been like for that father in his final seconds, to realize that his love had led to disaster. The emotional weight of that moment could not be measured by instruments or data. It was human, raw, and eternal. Years later, when new pilots trained on modern simulators, instructors would often pause and say, "Remember Flight 593. Not as a warning of recklessness, but as a reminder that compassion and caution must coexist in the cockpit." The legacy of that crash reshaped safety culture, making the invisible boundaries clearer, the responsibilities heavier. And yet, for all the procedural changes and technological upgrades, there remains one thing no manual can teach: a father's heart. The memory of Eldar and his father remains one of the most haunting in the annals of flight. The sky, vast and unforgiving, had become their final horizon. To this day, when flight crews pass over Siberia, some quietly look down at the endless white landscape and think of them, the boy who wanted to see the stars from his father's world, and the father who wanted to share his dream. In that frozen silence below, their story still lingers, not as blame, but as a whisper, that love, while powerful and pure, must never override the discipline that keeps humanity safely aloft. It is a story that endures not because of how it ended, but because of what it reminds us, that even the strongest hearts can falter, and that sometimes tragedy is not born from malice or failure, but from love itself. Months passed, but the memory of Flight 593 refused to fade. The story had spread across continents, sparking endless discussions in aviation schools, flight control centers, and households around the world. Pilots debated what they would have done differently, while families whispered the story to each other as a cautionary tale. The faces of the victims appeared on television memorials. Businessmen, students, families, and children, all united by fate in a single night's journey that never reached its end. And at the center of it all was the haunting image of a father and son in the cockpit, a moment of human warmth transformed into an unthinkable tragedy. The world wanted answers, not just about the technical failure, but about the emotions that led to it. What had truly gone through that father's mind when he invited his son to the controls? Was it pride, love, or just the desire to share something beautiful before another long separation? Those questions lingered like ghosts long after the wreckage had been cleared. In Moscow, Captain Kudrinsky's surviving relatives were besieged by reporters. The public's anger was fierce at first, calling him reckless, careless, unfit to fly. But as more details emerged, the tone shifted. People began to see not a villain, but a man a father trying to bond with his children in a world where family moments were rare. Flight schedules were grueling, time with loved ones scarce, and the cockpit had been his second home. For one fleeting evening, he wanted his children to feel what he felt: the quiet power of flight, the beauty of the sky, the pride of steering an aircraft through the stars. None of it was done with arrogance or disregard. It was a moment of trust, of warmth, that fate cruelly twisted into tragedy. Even his colleagues, men and women who had flown beside him, defended his character. They spoke of his professionalism, his discipline, his love for his family. They wept during interviews, describing him as a man who lived for the skies and died by them. Inside Aeroflot's training academy, the incident became a core lesson in human factors and cockpit management. Trainees were shown transcripts and simulator replays, where the subtle sequence of events was reenacted second by second. They could see how the plane had banked slightly, how the warning light blinked for just a moment before vanishing into the panel's glow, how the autopilot silently disengaged only in one axis, leaving the pilots unaware. It was not just a mechanical story, it was psychological, emotional, and deeply human. Instructors would pause the playback during the laughter and ask the room, "What would you have done?" Silence often followed, as each pilot realized how easy it was to let comfort dull awareness, how fragile the boundary between confidence and catastrophe truly was. The case was added to international safety courses, discussed in conferences, and cited in manuals as an example of how no system, no matter how advanced, can save a flight when discipline slips, even for a moment. Meanwhile, international investigators examined every aspect of the Airbus's design. The partial disengagement of autopilot controls had not been widely known among pilots, particularly in fleets transitioning from older analog aircraft to newer digital ones. In older jets, any disengagement was accompanied by loud, unmistakable warnings. But in this model, the handover was subtle: an amber light, a quiet click, a system that assumed the human pilot understood what it had done. Airbus engineers worked closely with regulators to redesign warning protocols, ensuring future pilots would never face such ambiguity again. Changes were made to training programs globally, teaching crews how to recognize partial system failures instantly. Out of tragedy came progress, but it came at a heartbreaking price: the lives of all aboard Flight 593. In Hong Kong, where the plane was meant to land, airport staff kept the arrival gate closed that morning. Families waited behind the barrier, eyes fixed on the monitors that never changed from delayed. Hours turned into an unbearable silence. Then officials arrived with solemn faces, escorting relatives into a private room. Some screamed, some fainted, others simply sat in stunned disbelief. There are no words heavy enough to hold the weight of such moments, the instant when hope collapses into horror. Days later, the remains of the passengers were flown back to Moscow and other destinations for burial. Funeral after funeral filled the cold spring days, with lines of mourners stretching outside chapels and memorial halls. The sound of crying mingled with the soft fall of snow, as if the heavens themselves wept for the souls lost in the sky. Among those who attended was a quiet man who had once trained with Kudrinsky years before. He spoke softly during a memorial, saying, "We fly believing we control the sky, but sometimes the sky reminds us who's in control." His words resonated deeply with everyone present. Pilots often speak of mastery, precision, and confidence, but Flight 593 reminded them that humility is the truest safety measure of all. The co-pilot's son, Eldar, became a symbol, not of blame, but of the innocence that lives within every human error. His curiosity was natural, his desire to understand his father's world beautiful. The tragedy was not born from mischief, but from a small misunderstanding amplified by the unforgiving laws of physics. It was a story that revealed how even love, the purest human emotion, can create unforeseen consequences in an environment where precision and procedure must rule above all else. In the years that followed, films and documentaries revisited the tragedy, each retelling highlighting a different aspect: the human, the technical, the emotional. Some focused on the cockpit sequence, analyzing the mechanics of the crash in slow detail, while others focused on the family side: the boy, the father, the final moments they shared. Psychologists studied the case as an example of how emotion can override professional instinct, how familiarity breeds comfort, and how comfort can blind even the best trained minds to danger. To the public, it became more than a disaster. It became a story about the fragile balance between humanity and responsibility. Every March, survivors' families and pilots gather quietly to remember. They light candles in front of the memorial stone engraved with all 75 names, now worn smooth by the passing years. In the cold air, the flames flicker, reflecting in the tears of those who still come, even after decades. They place flowers, letters, and photographs beneath the stone, whispering words meant for those who never came home. Some pilots bring their own children, holding their hands tightly, silently teaching them that the privilege of flight is bound to respect and vigilance. And when the ceremony ends, a moment of silence fills the air, broken only by the sound of wind sweeping through the tall grass, a whisper from the mountain that still remembers that night. The legacy of Flight 593 endures not just in aviation regulations, but in the collective memory of everyone who has ever looked out an airplane window and marveled at the beauty of flight. It serves as a reminder that the sky, as majestic as it is, remains indifferent to human emotion. It demands precision, discipline, and humility. Yet at the same time, it reminds us that every tragedy leaves behind lessons written not in ink or data, but in the hearts of those who live to remember. Flight 593's story remains one of the most heartbreaking in aviation history, not because of its horror alone, but because of its humanity. It shows that even among the stars, where technology reigns, it is still the human heart that defines every moment of the journey. For better or for worse, years later, the cold winds that swept across the Siberian mountains still carried the quiet memory of Flight 593. The wreckage had long been cleared, the investigation completed, and aviation safety forever changed, but the story lived on, not in statistics or reports, but in the hearts of those who remembered. In flight schools, instructors spoke the name with reverence, pilots read about it in their manuals, and families still placed flowers at the memorial every spring. For the world, it was an aviation accident. But for those who understood its depth, it was a moment that revealed everything about human nature: love, pride, curiosity, and the tragic price of a single moment's distraction. The site itself became almost sacred. Locals in the Kuznetsk region would often say that on some nights, when the snow was heavy and the wind whispered through the trees, you could still hear faint echoes, like voices calling from above, or the distant hum of engines fading into silence. Hunters avoided the ridge, saying it felt like the air itself carried grief. And sometimes, travelers who passed through that region would stop by the small wooden cross built on the site, leaving behind a candle or a toy airplane, a quiet symbol of remembrance for souls who left too soon. Back in Moscow, years after the tragedy, aviation culture had evolved. Young pilots now trained on advanced simulators that replicated every possible failure, every warning light, every unexpected sound. In those simulations, instructors would quietly remind their students, "This is how Flight 593 began." The trainees would nod solemnly, understanding that the story they were reliving wasn't fiction, it was the echo of real lives lost. Each button they pressed, each correction they made, was guided by the ghosts of that night. The changes that had come from the tragedy were vast and lasting. Airlines across the globe enforced stricter cockpit access laws, automation awareness became mandatory study, and new fail-safes were built into aircraft systems so that even a partial disengagement would scream for attention. The skies became safer because of what had happened. But no pilot ever celebrated that fact, because behind those improvements was the memory of a father's final flight and the son who never meant any harm. In the years following the investigation, journalists returned to interview those who had worked on the case. One investigator, older now, with lines etched deep across his face, recalled the night the recorders were played for the first time. "I had listened to many crash tapes before," he said softly, "but never one that began with laughter." He paused, looking away as though still hearing it. "You can tell when something starts as joy and turns into fear. It's a sound you never forget." For him, it was not just another case file. It was a portrait of how thin the line between life and death can be when humans place their trust in machines. And in those final minutes, the machines had trusted humans just as humans trusted the machines, each expecting the other to correct the mistake. But there had been no time. The systems worked as designed, and the people worked as they knew how, yet together they created a moment that neither could escape. That paradox became a lesson that would define aviation philosophy for decades to come. Among the many families who lost loved ones, some found a strange form of peace in knowing that their tragedy had saved future lives. One mother, whose daughter had been on that flight, spoke at a remembrance ceremony years later. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of a lifetime of sorrow. "They are gone," she said, "but they taught the world something. Their loss wasn't in vain. Every safe flight today carries their memory." Her words struck deeply in everyone who heard them. Even pilots standing among the crowd lowered their heads, feeling the connection between their duty and her pain. The story of Flight 593 had become a shared moral compass, one that reminded everyone who touched the sky that the smallest lapse in judgment could ripple across generations. In the global aviation community, engineers, designers, and psychologists all took something from this disaster. Engineers redesigned the human-machine interface, ensuring that pilots could never mistake the aircraft's status again. Psychologists studied the emotional dynamics that exist inside a cockpit, the invisible weight of hierarchy, the effects of fatigue, and the influence of emotion in critical decision-making. From those studies emerged the modern concept of crew resource management, a system of communication and teamwork that became a foundation of safety across all airlines. And though the name of Flight 593 was rarely spoken aloud in official documents, its shadow was present in every safety manual, every training session, every cockpit door that now remained locked during flight. The ghosts of that night had quietly reshaped the very way humanity flew. Meanwhile, the families of the victims continued to live in the long shadow of what happened. Some moved on, building new lives, raising children who grew up hearing stories about uncles, mothers, or grandparents they never met. Others could never move past it. For them, time did not heal, it only dulled the sound of the screams. They would sometimes receive calls from reporters or documentary producers, asking for interviews, for memories, for quotes. Some agreed, hoping the story would keep others safe. Others refused, wanting to keep their pain private. One father, whose wife had been a flight attendant on Flight 593, kept her uniform folded neatly in a drawer. He never remarried. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, he took a walk near the airport, watching planes rise into the sky until they disappeared among the clouds. "She loved this," he once said, looking up with a trembling smile. "The sky took her, but it's still where she belongs." In later years, documentaries revisited the tragedy with fresh technology, digitally reconstructing the cockpit events, showing the plane's silent roll, the confused flight crew, the rising alarms, and the desperate final moments. Viewers around the world watched in silence as the reenactments played out. Even those who had never heard of the flight before found themselves moved, some to tears, others to quiet reflection. The story transcended its technical explanation, it became a symbol of empathy. It reminded people that even experts, even professionals with thousands of hours of experience, were still human, still vulnerable to emotion and misjudgment. It was a story that showed how fragile the balance is between life and death, and how one moment, one gesture of kindness, could unintentionally open the door to disaster. And yet, despite its sorrow, Flight 593's legacy became a story of redemption. The world had learned. Pilots grew more aware, passengers safer, technology more intuitive. Out of the ashes rose a stronger, wiser aviation culture. The mountain that once bore the wreckage became a silent teacher, a monument not just to loss, but to the enduring will to learn from pain. The father and son who perished together became immortal in aviation's memory, not for their mistake but for the change their story brought. Even now, when a plane ascends through clouds over Russia, slicing through that cold, endless sky, somewhere far below lies the resting place of Flight 593. The snow covers it like a white blanket, peaceful and eternal. Pilots who know the story often glance at their instruments, checking one more time, adjusting one more setting, silently whispering a thank you to those who taught them caution through their sacrifice. The sky remains vast, indifferent, and unforgiving, but safer because humanity dared to look into its own flaws and learn. Flight 593 may have fallen, but its story rose higher than the clouds, carried on every safe landing, every calm voice in a cockpit, every father who looks at his child and remembers that love, even in the sky, must be guided by care and awareness. Decades have passed since the night Flight 593 vanished into the Siberian darkness, yet the tragedy has never truly left the minds of those who study the sky. Time has softened the pain but never erased the lesson. Each new generation of pilots, engineers, and air traffic controllers still whispers its name with quiet respect, aware that the story behind it reshaped everything they know about aviation safety, human behavior, and responsibility. The cold mountains where the aircraft struck now lie still beneath layers of snow and silence. No debris remains, no wreckage to tell the story, but the land remembers. Trees grow over the scarred ridge, and during certain winters, when the snow melts just right, faint traces of burned soil reappear beneath the ice. Locals say it's the Earth's way of remembering the lives that were lost there. Sometimes travelers leave offerings, flowers, folded paper cranes, even small model airplanes, tokens of remembrance for the 75 souls who never returned. Inside aviation classrooms, Flight 593 is not just another case study, it's a lesson written in emotion as much as in data. Instructors dim the lights and play reconstructed audio, letting the voices of the cockpit fill the room. The laughter, the confusion, the alarms, it all plays out again in chilling realism. The young cadets, seated in silence, hear the humanity behind the technical jargon. They realize that the sky doesn't forgive distraction, that 1 second of misjudgment can erase everything. When the recording ends, the room stays quiet for a long moment before the instructor speaks. "This is why procedures exist," he says softly. "Not because we doubt our hearts, but because we must protect them from moments like this." Those words echo in the minds of future pilots long after they leave training. They know that discipline in the air isn't about fear, it's about love expressed through precision. In the years that followed the crash, Aeroflot transformed. The airline, once scarred by the tragedy, rebuilt its identity around safety and professionalism. They modernized fleets, retrained crews, and introduced some of the strictest cockpit policies in the world. International aviation authorities credited the Flight 593 incident as a key influence in developing stronger cockpit resource management and improved human-machine interface alert. Airbus redesigned their systems, ensuring no partial autopilot disconnection could go unnoticed again. In a way, every modern aircraft flying today, every beep, every flashing light that warns a pilot before disaster, carries the ghostly fingerprint of that night. The tragedy became the silent guardian of millions of passengers who would never know the names of those who died to keep them safe. For the families of the victims, life continued in fragments. Some found meaning in activism, joining aviation safety organizations or speaking at memorial events. Others retreated into private silence, visiting the graves each year with flowers and folded notes. One woman, who lost both her husband and young daughter on Flight 593, returned to the crash site years later. She stood quietly at the memorial stone, her face aged by time and sorrow. The wind howled around her as she whispered to the mountain, "I forgive you." Her words drifted into the cold air, merging with the snow. She said she no longer felt anger toward the father in the cockpit, only sadness, understanding that his love for his child was the same love she had lost. In that moment, her forgiveness became a kind of peace, not just for herself, but for everyone who still carried the burden of that night. Around the world, aviation historians continued to write about Flight 593, not with blame, but with compassion. They described it as a human tragedy in a mechanical age, a story that transcended borders and professions. It wasn't about failure, it was about humanity's eternal struggle to balance emotion and responsibility. The case became a reminder that even the most advanced machines rely on the imperfect beings who operate them, and that no matter how far technology advances, empathy and awareness remain our greatest safeguards. Pilots began to talk more openly about mental focus, emotional fatigue, and the invisible pressures that come with command. In a strange way, Flight 593 brought humanity back to the cockpit. It reminded the world that flying isn't just about numbers and switches, but about life, love, and accountability. In the quiet halls of aviation museums, among models of legendary aircraft and faded photographs of pioneers, a small exhibit now tells the story of Flight 593. Inside a glass case lies a simple artifact recovered from the crash site, a worn wristwatch, its hands forever frozen at the moment of impact. The plaque beside it reads, "In memory of those who flew toward the stars and taught the world to fly safer." Visitors often pause here longer than at the larger exhibit. Something about that stopped watch captures the essence of the tragedy, time itself frozen, but its lesson eternal. Nearby, a small touchscreen display plays a short film about the investigation and the global changes that followed. Children watching it ask their parents, "How could a boy fly a plane?" The parents, often unsure how to answer, simply say, "It was an accident." But for those who understand the full story, it's more than that. It's a story about innocence colliding with duty, love entangled with fate, and how even good intentions can lead to heartbreak when vigilance fades. To this day, pilots who fly the route over Siberia often mark the coordinates of Flight 593's final descent in their minds. Some look out through the cockpit window, the stars stretching endlessly across the horizon, and they remember the voices of that night. In that silence between radio calls, they think of the father and his son, and of the lesson carved in the sky forever. Many pilots quietly perform a ritual, checking their systems twice, glancing again at the autopilot, a silent tribute to those who taught them the cost of assumption. The cockpit is quieter now, stricter, more focused, yet within that professionalism lingers a deep respect for what was lost. The story of Flight 593 changed not only how humans fly, but how they feel about flight itself. And so, as the years stretch on and technology continues to evolve, one truth remains: the sky demands both awe and humility. It is beautiful, vast, and unforgiving, a mirror that reflects every strength and flaw within the human heart. The father who once smiled proudly as his son touched the controls never meant harm. He was sharing love, pride, and wonder. But in that moment, the sky reminded humanity that even love must bow to discipline. That lesson endures every time a jet leaves the ground, every time passengers trust their lives to the unseen hands guiding them through the clouds. Flight 593 may have fallen, but its legacy rises with every takeoff, every safe landing, every pilot who whispers a quiet promise to never forget. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If you felt the weight of Flight 593's journey, the heartbreak, the lessons, and the enduring humanity behind the tragedy, please consider subscribing to my channel. Here, we honor those who were lost, remember the lessons they left behind, and tell the stories that continue to shape our skies. because behind every flight number, every headline, and every crash report, there are real people, souls who remind us that the sky is not just a place of dreams, but of duty. Stay safe, cherish your loved ones, and I'll see you in the next story.